Have you ever taken a psychedelic? Imagine the world around you spinning like a kaleidoscope. Every person you see takes a colorful, threatening form in your mind's eye. The world is warped like a funhouse mirror, and then you have to bike home. That's just what happened when the scientist behind LSD tested his concoction for the first time on himself. It was 1943. Albert Hofmann didn't set out to create a psychedelic drug or have a hallucination. He was merely following his scientific curiosity when he drank the substance. Albert may have been the first to try lysergic acid diethylamide, but he was far from the first to alter his consciousness with psychedelics. But during recent decades, psychedelics have been blamed for tragedies like the Manson murders, demonized, and largely pushed to the margins of society. Today, we may be on the cusp of a new chapter of psychedelics. From microdosing to mental health care, scientists are finding new and novel purposes for psychoactive substances that may return them to the mainstream. What place might psychedelics hold in the future of our societies? Let's explore the past, present, and future of psychedelics. The terms psychedelic and hallucinogen are often used interchangeably to describe drugs that profoundly alter a person's perception of their surroundings. Hallucinogens come in both natural and synthetic forms. The most well-known natural hallucinogen is psilocybin, the psychoactive substance in Psilocybe cubensis, or what most people call magic mushrooms. Then there's mescaline, usually found in peyote and San Pedro cacti. When it comes to synthetics, there are hundreds, but the most famous synthetic psychedelics are LSD and the entheogenic party drug MDMA. These synthesized psychedelics are relatively new without significant study, but humans around the world have been experimenting with the natural hallucinogens for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. Archaeologists have found the bones of hallucinogenic toads buried with priests from the first major civilization in Mesoamerica, the Olmec. It is likely that they used the psychoactive substances on the toad's skin in rituals. That society lasted from around 12,000 BCE to around 400 BCE. The Olmec weren't the only Mesoamerican civilization to use hallucinogens in their religious practices. Perhaps the most well-known use of hallucinogens was by the Aztecs. They would consume psilocybin mushrooms called teonanacatl, which means flesh of the gods. As legend goes, the serpent god Quetzalcoatl came down to earth to rule as king. While he was in physical form, his blood dripped across the region. Where it fell, these magic mushrooms emerged. Anthropologists say that people would take the mushrooms to see Quetzalcoatl as part of a religious ritual. But when the Spanish invaded and took over the region, the Catholic clergy condemned the rituals as the work of the devil. The tradition was pushed to the margins. When most people think of psychedelics today, they think of the 1960s. During that era, LSD was a large part of counterculture, with music, art, literature, and film seeking to simulate or augment the experience of taking acid. At the time, LSD was only a couple decades old. It was first synthesized by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1938. Hofmann was working for a pharmaceutical company, trying to create a chemical compound that would stimulate the respiratory and circulatory systems. The chemical compound lysergic acid was the focus of Hofmann's research. He was experimenting with different combinations of organic molecules and lysergic acid. The 25th molecule he tried was diethylamine, a derivative of ammonia. The result was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. When this new compound was tested on animals, they became highly excited. But as Hofmann wrote in his book, the new substance, however, aroused no special interest in our pharmacologists and physicians. Testing was therefore discontinued. Although Hofmann's research moved on from LSD, he had a nagging feeling that there was more to learn about the compound. So 5 years after it had been dismissed, he decided to synthesize LSD-25 once more. Hoffman was nearly done with the process at the stage when the LSD crystallized into a salt, when he began to feel strange. He described it in a memo to his boss as a remarkable restlessness, combined with a slight dizziness, which forced him to go home for the day. That experience, Hoffman decided, warranted further research. So he decided to intentionally ingest some LSD to see what would happen. The result led to that famous bike ride home, which Hoffman followed up with more testing on himself and a couple of his friends. Hoffman's employer, Sandoz Laboratories, began marketing LSD in 1947 under the trade name Delicid. Sandoz billed it as a sort of psychiatric cure-all for everything including schizophrenia, criminal behavior, alcoholism, and more. Research on LSD boomed from the late 1940s until the mid-1970s. The drug was prescribed to tens of thousands of patients, examined in more than 1,000 research papers, and discussed at conferences. Then, the United States government took notice. In the early 1950s, US leaders were focused on the influence of the Soviet Union and communism. They were concerned that communist regimes were brainwashing US soldiers and even their own people. To those in charge, it became imperative to understand how they might be doing it and whether the US could employ their own brainwashing tactics. LSD became of particular interest. In 1953, the CIA began a top-secret program called MK-Ultra to determine if they could alter someone's behavior using electroshock therapy, hypnosis, polygraphs, radiation, and a variety of drugs, toxins, and chemicals, especially LSD. The CIA used a range of test subjects, including volunteers who had agreed under coercion, and some who had no idea they were being tested or dosed. Those included unknowing CIA colleagues, American soldiers, some patients at state hospitals, mentally impaired students at state schools, and prisoners. MK-Ultra's ethics were dubious at best. But a few years into the program, the CIA took it a step further with what they called Operation Midnight Climax. The agency set up safe houses with a bedroom specially designed so that its inhabitants could be observed through a one-way mirror. The room was also bugged. The CIA hired sex workers to lure men to this bedroom and secretly dose them with LSD. The CIA's tests with LSD ended in 1963 as new research ethics guidelines were enforced. MK-Ultra didn't just inform the US government on the effects of LSD, however. Ken Kesey, who went on to be the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, volunteered as a test subject in 1959. By the early 60s, Kesey had begun his own experiments with LSD, introducing the drug into his bohemian intellectual community. Along with friends, he threw what was called acid test parties, complete with psychedelic light shows and the sounds of house band The Grateful Dead. These parties had a strong influence in kicking off the psychedelic counterculture era of the 1960s. States began to outlaw LSD in 1966, and possession of the drug was made illegal federally in 1968. Research on psychedelics ground to a halt in the 1970s. Today, LSD is listed as a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act, which, according to the US Department of Justice website, is for drugs that have a, quote, high potential for abuse and serve no legitimate medical purpose. However, ethnobotanist and psychedelic advocate Terence McKenna asserted in the 1990s that psychedelics were made illegal not because of any harm caused to an individual. Rather, he suggested that the way that they made a user question reality may have been seen as a threat to those in power. It's not a stretch to imagine that such a threat was also perceived by the Spanish conquerors when they outlawed magic mushroom rituals in Mesoamerica centuries earlier. In the mid-20th century, scientists uncovered evidence that some of these ancient customs had managed to withstand the arrival of the conquerors. It turns out the indigenous Mazatec people of Mexico were still using hallucinogenic mushroom rituals to diagnose illnesses. The rituals consist of two approaches. Either a shaman consumes the mushrooms and then can see the sick person's ailment, or the sick person consumes it themselves. Following the scientists' rediscovery of the tradition, Westerners began to travel to the Sierra Mazatec region to try the healing ceremonies firsthand. They were met by Maria Sabina, a healer from the Mazatec tribe who would guide them through the ritual. Today, we're seeing a resurgence of rituals utilizing natural psychedelics like ayahuasca, magic mushrooms, and peyote at wellness retreats in South America. Although official research on psychedelics came to a halt in the 1970s, not all scientists stopped experimenting. Chemist and pharmacologist Alexander Shulgin heard about a psychedelic first created by a German company in 1912, MDMA, and decided to figure out how to synthesize it himself. He's given credit for introducing the drug to the Western US in the 1970s, which earned him the nickname the Godfather of Ecstasy. But Shulgin didn't stop there. In his home laboratory, he studied and synthesized more than 200 other psychoactive compounds, testing them on himself and his wife. Shulgin shared the results of his experiential experiments in a 1991 book titled Phenylethylamines I Have Known and Loved. Shulgin and others who experimented like him may have set the stage for a new chapter in the psychedelic story. Today, that kind of underground research has shifted back into more traditional scientific settings, and psychedelics are once again being probed for their uses. Since the 1980s, psychedelics have emerged as potential medical tools for a range of ailments. There have been clinical trials using LSD and psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, to help relieve terminal cancer patients' anxiety and distress about death. And last year, a study was published detailing how MDMA can be a powerful tool in catalyzing healing from PTSD and other trauma in conjunction with traditional forms of therapy. This shift in the professional and legal attitude towards psychedelics has also opened the door for recreational users to become more visible and less stigmatized. Groups like the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies have organized psychedelic proponents to support the development of psychedelic therapy, support groups, risk reduction education, and policy advocacy. But there's been a notable change in how many users are taking the drugs. They're consuming much smaller doses. For example, in the 1960s, LSD doses were often around 250 micrograms. That's of the see God variety. That shifted to be around 100 micrograms back in the 80s. But in recent years, doses have shrunk down to even just 10 micrograms. This approach is called microdosing. Scientists have found that the effect of microdosing on mental health may be minimal, but some microdosers have reported that a tiny bit of a psychedelic can reduce minor anxiety, diminish depression, and generally provide the benefits of a larger dose without the full hallucinogenic effect. In essence, with microdosing, the use of psychedelic drugs may become divorced from the psychedelic experience. Hallucinogens are moving from the margins to the mainstream, and not as tools of war or manipulation this time. Central to this shift is the idea that the context under which the drugs are consumed matters to bring about a therapeutic result. Much like Maria Sabina guided adherents through their trips as a spiritual healer, clinical therapists are working with their patients to facilitate a healing experience. Scientists also aren't just studying how someone's behavior or reported mental state changes after a trip. They're also studying what happens in the brain of someone using a psychedelic drug in order to understand whether or not it might provide useful treatment. For example, researchers have recently been trying to understand how psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, might help break the cycle of rumination on negative thoughts that is a characteristic of depression. To do that, scientists are using fMRI brain scanning to observe activity in the part of the brain associated with rumination. They found that just one dose of psilocybin can stimulate an increase in the brain activity that is typically reduced in people with severe depression. Such a regimented medical approach might seem like a far cry from the psychedelic trips of the 1960s, or the spiritual rituals to see the serpent god Quetzalcoatl in hallucinations. But this focus on healing is not all that far removed from historical hallucinogenic rituals. Perhaps Maria Sabina could be thought of as an early psychiatric therapist. The reality-challenging characteristic of psychedelic drugs was once seen as a threat to those in power, and hallucinogens were repeatedly banished to the margins of society. But now, they may be prompting a new kind of open-mindedness. As researchers examine the usefulness of psychedelic drugs for clinical settings, and users microdose for a tripless experience, psychedelics may soon be more readily accepted as part of modern society. For more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell to make sure you don't miss any great content. and look for CuriosityStream on social media. Links in the description.